Hello, everyone. I want to talk to you guys about why we cannot stop evil. A lot of people think, well, if we just follow God, we will defeat evil and we will crush evil, etc., etc. Uh, we cannot crush evil by ourselves. It is actually just damn impossible. It is an impossible feat. The only way that evil can be defeated is by a sheer miracle. And evil is allowed to happen, and as long as evil is allowed to happen, we are not going to be defeating evil. Evil can only be defeated through a miracle. Now, why do I say this? Well, because it really just comes down to the nature of human beings. Human beings have a propensity towards evil. There is something very alluring about evil. It's sort of like the shiny bait in the water. For some strange reason, fishes love it, and I really can't explain why. There's just something fascinating about it. And it just goes back to that story in the book of Genesis where you have Adam and Eve in the garden, and Eve sees the fruit, and the Bible says that the fruit was very alluring. She was magnetized towards the fruit. She was very fascinated by its color, by its tint, and so she ate the fruit, even though God himself told her, don't eat the fruit. So if God himself wasn't enough to keep Eve from eating the fruit, guess what? We are not defeating evil unless there is an absolute divine intervention. We're not winning. It's like the film The Exorcist. You have the demon in the girl, and then you have the two priests, and they're trying to exorcise the demon out of her. And you have the righteous priest. Well, they're both righteous to a certain extent, but I mean, Father Karras is sort of a doubting Thomas in the beginning. He's really into psychology, but eventually he gets through. He makes it. He eventually has faith, but you have the older priest who is, more experienced, more mature. He has more faith, and he is really defeating this demon, but he dies. He gets a heart attack or something, and he dies. And then you have Father Karras, and Father Karras tries, but he just doesn't have sufficient faith. And so he tells the demon to come inside of him, and the demon enters him, and then Father Karras kills himself, and Father Karras loses. And so it's sort of like that. Without sheer divine intervention, we're not defeating evil. God himself can tell us, hey, don't do this and don't do that, and guess what? We do it. And so this is the reason why history repeats itself. People say, well, history works in cycles and human existence works in cycles. And that's true, right? I am a firm believer of that. Now, if you notice any sort of sweat, it's because I just got out of the shower. But I am a firm believer that we as human beings, we work in cycles. We do something ridiculously sinister and evil and destructive, like, I don't know, a world war, a massive genocide. We end up trying to exterminate another people. And then we learn our lesson. We go through something absolutely cataclysmic, absolutely apocalyptic, catastrophic. And then we say, listen, let's not do that again. We have learned our lesson, and then we tell younger generations, hey, don't make the same mistakes that we did, because then you'll end up in the same sort of turmoil that we ended up in. And the first younger generation, the next generation will say, okay, our parents told us not to do this, and they tell the younger generation, hey, don't do this because our grandparents made this mistake and they ended up in a pretty terrible situation. But somewhere along the line, down that road of posterity, you'll have eventually a generation that'll say, you know what, our great-grandparents or maybe our great-great-grandparents were wrong. And perhaps the bad guys were right. So you guys know where I'm heading to. World War II. So World War II. World War II was an absolute apocalyptic event. We all know this. But we go back to the evils of Nazism. And for generations, we have been told, well, not really generations, but for decades, we have been told Nazism is absolutely evil. There's nothing good about it. Hitler was utterly evil. There was nothing good about him. Churchill was the hero, and the Holocaust happened. And the generation after the World War II generation was told this. They accepted it. They embraced it wholeheartedly. The boomer generation was told all these things, and they embraced it wholeheartedly. That is why the American boomer generation is the most pro-Israel generation in the history of the Jewish people, because they were told, listen, we have to support Israel because look at what happened in the Holocaust. And there is a good thing about this, right? I mean, I don't like this idea of just absolutely, utterly condemning support for Israel. I don't like this idea of just hating on Israel because it's the Jewish state. I think that's wrong. I think we should criticize Israel because Israel has actually done evil things. That is the reason. But this idea of just hating on Israel because it's Jewish is just it's just Hitlerian, really. But the boomer generation said, yeah, we got to support Israel because of the Holocaust. And the boomer generation told the millennial generation, yeah, you have to support Israel, etc., etc. And because of human nature, we will rebel. Eventually, human beings will rebel. And the Holocaust has become something that you are expected to accept and believe. And when something is so collectively believed in or so collectively accepted, what happens is that people will just believe that it happened without really knowing any serious details about it. They'll just say, yeah, the Holocaust, of course, it happened. That's it. It happened, and they just accept it. So the problem with this, now there's nothing wrong with telling people about the Holocaust. There's nothing wrong with telling people to believe that the Holocaust happened because it is an actual historical event, just like the American Revolution, just like the French Revolution. There's nothing wrong with teaching people about the Holocaust. There is a problem when the Holocaust or any sort of seriously historical event that we can definitely learn the lessons from becomes something that is just collectively believed in without understanding the details of the event. That is dangerous. And the reason why it's dangerous is because you have people who seriously study the Holocaust, or they will study the Holocaust to a certain extent, and they actually will begin to teach Holocaust denialism. They will tell people that the Holocaust didn't happen, and they will tell people that Hitler was actually a great person. He was a hero against the communists, and they will take certain facts about the Holocaust or World War II. They will isolate those facts from the totality of history, and then guess what? Because they have this knowledge, they appear knowledgeable about the subject, and then the people who simply were told to believe in the Holocaust without actually learning about its details will say, wait a second, this guy knows what he's talking about, and they will accept, or they will be convinced that Holocaust denialism is actually correct. And here lies the danger of just accepting historical events without understanding their details. Manipulators, people who manipulate history, people who distort history will come along and say, oh, that Holocaust thing didn't happen. Here's why. I'm the one who has the knowledge here. You don't. And because the person doesn't have the knowledge on the Holocaust, he will hear someone who has distorted the historical facts and will say, oh, this guy makes sense. And he will be convinced that Holocaust denialism is correct. And Holocaust denialism begins to grow. So then what happens as a response to this? What happens is you have a bunch of people in the ADL, Jewish organizations, pro-Israel organizations that will come along and say, oh my goodness, look, we have people teaching Holocaust denialism in universities. This is terrible. And they will begin to protest. And the ADL will begin to try to pressure universities or pressure certain platforms not to give a voice or not to give a platform to Holocaust deniers. So, for example, back in the 1990s, there was a man by the name of Bradley Smith. Bradley Smith was a sort of famous Holocaust denier back in the decade of the 1990s. And Bradley Smith's whole strategy was to write an article or to get an article that tried to prove Holocaust denialism. And he worked to get that article published in various newspapers for major universities. So every major university has a newspaper, and he would try to get an article pushing Holocaust denialism published in these university newspapers. And he actually got quite a bit of success, and really his main victory or his main accomplishment was actually getting people to protest against him, because universities would publish his article. And then Jewish groups would come along and say, hey, why is this major university publishing Holocaust denialism? What the hell is going on? And they'll begin to protest. And guess what happens? Bradley Smith, he gets the attention that he wants. That's exactly what happened. Bradley Smith got all the attention that he wanted. He got the publicity that he wanted. There were news outlets talking about him. And he got that attention. And what happens when someone gets attention, even if it's negative attention, is he gets the spotlight. He gets the platforms. All of a sudden, this person is being invited to do debates. All of a sudden, Holocaust denialism becomes the other side of the coin. It becomes the other side of the debate. Now, what do we always hear about when it comes to any sort of contention on anything? We always hear, well, there's always another side. Let's hear the other side. So you have global warming, and then you have people who say global warming isn't a thing. You have evolution. You have people who say evolutionism isn't a thing, right? These are always the two sides that have this contention. You always have two sides. Well, the thing is that if you have the side that is pushing for the distortion of history to become the other side, well, then he begins to get a sense of legitimacy. He begins to get a sense of actually being a serious position, actually being a serious thinker who is to be perceived as someone who actually has the expertise on the subject. And so if you have debates between historians on the Holocaust and Holocaust deniers, well, then Holocaust denialism becomes a point of view. Holocaust denialism becomes a serious position. And once you get into that sort of situation, then Holocaust denialism becomes a part of the Overton window. It goes from being outside of the Overton window to actually having a position in the Overton window. And, well, at that point, you can't stop what's coming. At that point, the train has been set, and Holocaust denialism will continue to grow in popularity. And you can't win. That's the thing. And this goes back to what I said initially in the video. You cannot defeat evil. Evil is going to come because of the nature of human beings. So if human beings are told all the time for decades, the Holocaust happened, believe in the Holocaust. If you don't believe in the Holocaust, then you're a Nazi, etc., etc., there will come a point where human beings will rebel. Now, I don't agree with this way of thinking. I don't like this way of thinking that says, well, because something is a part of the establishment, that makes it automatically false or evil. I really don't accept this way of thinking because it leaves one open to all sorts of manipulation. It really leaves one open to becoming manipulated by contrarians, by people who have very insidious beliefs. But given the nature of human beings, given how we are so attracted to evil, given how evil is so alluring to us, we will always eventually rebel. So, I mean, we can go back to, let's say, the monarchy of Europe, or the many monarchies of Europe, or we can go back to, let's say, the monarchy of France. I mean, so many centuries of French people were told, hey, you have to accept the monarchy. The king is great. And people believed it. People wholeheartedly embraced their monarchs. And then there came a point where, well, what happened? You had the Enlightenment. Now, let's talk a little bit about this because this is a very fascinating topic. How human beings will always go towards rebellion in the end, or they will always eventually become rebellious. It is a very fascinating topic. Now, what eventually happens, or what ends up happening, is the establishment becomes abusive to a certain extent, right? Sometimes worse, sometimes not as bad, but nonetheless, they become abusive. And if you have abuse being done by the establishment, you will always have opportunists who will come along and they will say, look at these abusers, look at the establishment abusing the people, insulting the people, saying terrible things about the common folk. This is why you should follow me, or this is why you should follow some sort of rebel. And this is extremely effective. And historically, this has been proven to be very, very effective. So let me give you guys a great example. The Roman Catholic Church. For over 1,000 years, the Roman Catholic Church was Christianity in Europe, right? For a very, very long time, the Roman Catholic Church was Christianity. If you went back to medieval Europe and you told people that you were a Christian, they would have automatically assumed that you were a Roman Catholic. And this was the case for the longest time in Europe. And then what eventually happened? Well, what eventually happened was abuse. The Roman Catholic Church began to abuse its power. Well, you have to believe in this or else you're going to go to hell. Well, if you want to, let's say, save someone's soul in purgatory, then you should give us this much money, you should give us indulgences, and then you give us money, and then we'll pray for the soul of this person. Or if you're worried that you're going to go to hell after you spend time in purgatory, you can give us this much money, and then we'll pray for you, and then you can be saved from hell, and from purgatory you'll go to heaven, etc., right? This was obviously a theological, spiritual abuse, taking advantage of people's faith to get money from them. It's a form of extortion. And eventually people got sick of this. In fact, the Roman Catholic Church still does this today. It was amazing. I took a trip to the Vatican back in 2018, and it was quite amazing to see I want to say he was a priest or a monk. He was definitely a clergyman, and he was behind a booth. And on the booth was a sign that said, prayers, and I think it said something like €5 or whatever. I mean, he was asking for euros in exchange for prayers, so it's basically saying, if you give me some euros, I'll pray for the soul of whoever, or I'll pray for your salvation or something like that. And it just harkened back to the olden days of Christendom when the Catholic Church did stuff like that. And the Catholic Church was able to amass a tremendous amount of wealth through this sort of abuse. So in comes Martin Luther. And Martin Luther was evil. I have no doubt about it. I'm not going to argue that he was a good guy. Obviously, he was not. There's no argument there. He was evil, definitely a sinister individual. But what made Martin Luther so dangerous was the fact that he actually brought up very legitimate points. A lot of what Martin Luther said in his remonstrances against the Catholic Church were true. So, for example, he brought up the problem with indulgences, but he also brought up how the Roman Catholic Church used people to fight in their wars. Now, this is really fascinating because it reminds me of the United States government saying lies to people to get people to go to war in Iraq, and how that got really so many Americans to despise neoconservatism. It got so many Americans to despise American interventionism. Well, a similar thing happened back in the Protestant Reformation. And there's a speech that you can read where Martin Luther says something like, for how long has the Roman Catholic Church used the German race, used the German people as muscle to fight in its wars? And Martin Luther made this complaint, and it was a legitimate complaint. He was, of course, referring to the Crusades. Martin Luther hated the Crusades. He said they were a terrible idea. And in a sense, that he was correct. I mean, even though initially I would say the Crusades had a good mission, and that was to protect Christians in the East. But like anything, the Crusades became about power. They became about who was going to control Jerusalem, because if you could control Jerusalem, then you could really establish a serious position of power in Christendom, in the Christian world. But Martin Luther made the point of, for how long has the Catholic Church used the German people as muscle to fight in its foreign wars? And he said something to the likes of, why should we as Germans fight in the wars for an institution, Rome, that is hundreds and hundreds of miles away from us? That's so many miles away from us. What is the point? Why are we as German people being pushed to fight in the wars for an institution that has nothing to do with Germany, that is just super, super far away from Germany? It doesn't make any sense. And you could make the argument that Lutheranism, or the Protestant Reformation, was actually the first Germany first movement. I mean, I think you could actually make this argument, because Martin Luther was all about what? He was all about German Christianity. He wanted a German God. He wanted a German Bible. He wanted a German Jesus. He wanted to pray in German. and he was all about Germany. So he established the first Germany First movement, and he was the one who really commenced this idea of, I guess you could say, collective German consciousness. We are the German people. We have the German nation, the German nation, the German language, and this foreign institution is using us to fight in its wars, using us to fight in its crusades. The Crusades didn't just involve the Franks. They were people from all over Christendom who fought in the Crusades. So he made very legitimate points, and people began to follow Martin Luther. Why? Because they had the sense that, well, the Roman Catholic Church has been abusing us, Roman Catholic Church has been spiritually extorting us, so we're going to follow this guy. So you have the Protestant Reformation. It actually is very, very successful, and I want to say about 1/3 of Christendom, 1/3 of Western Christendom actually just fell for the Protestant Reformation. Protestantism just sparks this huge cataclysm of chaos and violence and wars, horrendous wars. So, for example, you have the Protestant Reformation in England, Protestants take over England eventually, and you have a bunch of fanatics. Who take over England, and they begin to persecute the Catholics in England. English Catholics went through tremendous persecution. Protestantism spreads like wildfire in Scotland. Protestantism becomes hugely popular in Scotland. Eventually, you have the Presbyterian Church in Scotland, and then you have the Puritans in England. You also, of course, have the Church of England, the Anglicans. The Anglicans become the dominant sect in England. But eventually, you have a civil war amongst the English. You have the Calvinists versus the Catholics. You have Scottish Protestants persecuting Scottish Catholics. The English begin to heavily persecute the Irish in Ireland, of course, obviously, right? The Protestants begin to persecute and slaughter the Catholics of Ireland. Oliver Cromwell persecutes heavily the Catholics of Ireland. Tremendous, tremendous violence. It's just horrific. And then in France, you have the rise of Calvinism. Jean Calvin was French at the end of the day. And the French go through this really bloody period known as the Wars of Religion. Horrendous wars in France, Catholics and Protestants killing each other. And then in Switzerland, you have a civil war called I want to say they're called the Kappel Wars. So there was the first Kappel War, and you have the second Kappel War. The first Kappel War involved Ulrich Zwingli, who was really one of the major heads of Protestantism in the Reformation. Zwingli was an absolute fanatic. And if I remember correctly, the Catholics actually lost the first Kappel War, and then they won the second Kappel War. But my whole point is that there was just absolute violence and bloodshed between Western Europeans. So you have tremendous, tremendous bloodshed. And all of this violence between Catholics and Protestants eventually reaches an apex. They eventually accumulate into an apex, and that apex is the 30 Years' War. Now, before World War I and World War II, the worst war that ever happened in Europe was the 30 Years' War. That's the worst war that we have in our historical record before World War I and World War II. 10 million people are slaughtered, people are starving, and there is really a curse that comes upon Europe. And there is a story that you can read in the historical record on the 30 Years' War, wherein you read about wolves being in various parts of Germany all of a sudden. You have villages in Germany that are being overran by wolves. Pretty certain it was Germany, but you have, let's just say you had villages in Europe that were just overran with wolves, just wolves everywhere eating people. And it got so bad that they actually had to set up local teams in the evening to make sure that the wolves didn't get into the village. And so people saw this sort of thing, and they said, this is a bad omen. This is terrible. This is a curse from God. And you could make the argument that the 30 Years' War was the first time that we got close to something like a world war. Sweden was involved, Norway, Denmark, Germany, all of Germany. You had France, Spain, Czechoslovakia, Bohemia, as it was known at the time. And it was, even the Ottoman Empire got involved to a certain extent. Poland was involved. The Ottoman Empire loved it because they said, hey, look, the Christians are killing each other. Western Christendom is divided. This is great for us because this means our big Christendom enemy is absolutely weakened and divided. So it was the closest thing that we got to a world war before World War I. And 10 million people were killed. And that was a huge number. I mean, today we could say, okay, 10 million, yeah, we got billions of people, but 10 million people at that time in the 17th century was a huge deal. And the 30 Years' War happens in the middle of the 1600s. And even after the 30 Years' War, there was still 50 more years of warfare between Spaniard and Frenchmen. The Spanish and the French, even though they were both Catholic, still continued to kill each other over power. And so, what happens also in the middle of the 1600s? What happens about maybe 2 decades or so after the 30 Years' War? You have the rise of the Enlightenment. And what did the Enlightenment say? The Enlightenment said, religion has been devastating Europe for far too long. It's time for a different way of thinking. This is pretty much what the Enlightenment said. And what they did, what the Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire did, is they pointed to the abuses of religion and they said, this is the problem with religion. Look at how we have been killing each other for so long. We had all the wars of religion in France, war over religion in England, war over religion in Switzerland, war over religion in Bohemia. And then we have the 30 Years' War, and this is the most devastating thing ever. And this is all because of religion. And this is what the Enlightenment thinkers argued. So they pointed to real abuses to get people on their side. And guess what? It worked. And Voltaire actually became quite famous because he wrote a book in defense of what he called, or what he held up as, rationalism. And it was a critique of religion. Religion is the problem. Protestantism, Roman Catholicism especially, the main target on the crosshairs of the Enlightenment thinker was the Roman Catholic Church. So Voltaire writes his treatise on tolerance, and he begins the treatise by talking about the story of a young man who committed suicide. And this young man was brought up in a Calvinist family, and he committed suicide. He was found dead one day. And his father was accused of murdering his son because his son wanted to convert to Catholicism, and he did not want a Catholic for a son. So the father was tried, he was found guilty, and he was executed. And a lot of people in France thought that it was a just execution because they were killing a man who murdered one of their fellow Catholics. And Voltaire said, no, this young man wasn't murdered by his father. This young man killed himself because he was going through a bunch of gambling debts. He had a bunch of gambling debts. He was a gambler. He got a bunch of debts, and he didn't know how to handle it, so he killed himself. And Voltaire was able to prove that the father was unjustly executed. So Voltaire says, why was this man unjustly executed? And he concluded it was because of religious intolerance. Because the man was a Calvinist, and he was accused of killing a Catholic, in this case his son. And so it became a very popular story because people said, oh, look, here's this evil Calvinist, and he unjustly murdered this young man. But Voltaire said this man was unjustly executed because he was a Calvinist. And he said at the root of this problem is religious intolerance. So it was a critique of the establishment religion. In this case, it was the Catholic Church. And so they basically said, this is the problem with Christianity. Rousseau comes along. He writes his Social Contract, and it is extremely anti-Christian. You have all these Enlightenment thinkers, Diderot, all these people are very anti-Christian, especially anti-Catholic. Diderot comes along and he says something like, I will finally be happy when the last king is strangled with the intestines of the last priest, or something like that. Well, what these guys did was they pointed to actual problems in Roman Catholicism or the Roman Catholic Church, and they used those problems to amass a following. This is what made them so effective. So this is the problem with human society. The problem is you have an idea that becomes very popular. That idea becomes the establishment. The establishment begins to abuse people from one, more or less, from one extent to another. It begins to abuse people, sometimes really horrendously, sometimes not as bad, but still abuse nonetheless. And then you have manipulators, you have political opportunists, ideological opportunists who come along and they say, this establishment is bad. This is why you should follow me. And then the masses will follow that person. So Roman Catholicism became the established belief. Roman Catholic Church abused people. People turned against it. It really is that simple. Same thing with, let's say, Puritanism in the United States. Puritanism was an established idea. It was very popular uh, in colonial America. Let's just put it that way. In the Massachusetts colony, Puritanism was very popular. But the problem with Puritanism is that it was very extremist. And Puritanism was bad from the beginning. It was never a good idea. So I'm not making Puritanism equal to Roman Catholicism. But what I am saying is that Puritanism ceased to exist because all it did was abuse people. That's all it did. It attacked Catholics. They killed Quakers. And the problem with Puritanism is that they were always trying to micromanage everything. That's all they were doing, was abusing people. They prevented people from celebrating Christmas. If a Quaker came into a Puritan area, they'd kill them. They were violent towards Roman Catholics. They were just absolutely tyrannical. They were tyrants, and they were always trying to micromanage everyone's life. And it eventually disintegrated. Why did it disintegrate? Because it was extremist and because it was abusive. So you can have a really good idea, like, let's say, the Roman Catholic Church started out as a noble, beautiful institution founded by God, absolutely. But just like ancient Israel, just like the institution of the temple in Israel, it eventually became abusive. And when it became abusive, it became unpopular, and people began to rebel. So let's fast forward to our own time. We have something called the mainstream media. And for the longest time, we have followed mainstream media for decades. And then what happened? People began to realize, wait a second, the mainstream media is not exactly trustworthy. They have spread lies. They have spread, great example, before the commencement of the Iraq War, you had major media outlets publishing articles by Zionist or by Israeli politicians. And these articles would say, we have to go to war with Iraq or else they're going to destroy Israel and they're going to attack the United States. And they have weapons of, Iraq has weapons of mass destruction. And so we have to stop them. And if we don't stop them, then we're just like Neville Chamberlain appeasing Adolf Hitler. And just as Neville Chamberlain gave Hitler time to advance his cause, advance the Third Reich, we are giving time to Saddam Hussein to make his weapons of mass destruction. And before you know it, it's going to be too late. And then you're going to have the Iraqi army storming the beaches of San Francisco. And that actually may have been a good thing. And so everything becomes this template of, well, if you don't do this policy, you're like Neville Chamberlain. If you want to do the right thing, then you have to do what we say. And if you do what we say, you're going to be like Winston Churchill. And because Winston Churchill was warning people about Adolf Hitler, but because no one listened to Winston Churchill, Hitler became extremely powerful, and before they knew it, it was too late. The Third Reich was super powerful, and Europe was engulfed in war. So the mainstream media was pushing these lies. They were giving a platform to these lies, and then because people believed in it, we ended up having the Iraq War disaster. We ended up getting stuck in a forever war. And just as Martin Luther said, why are we doing the wars of the Catholic Church? People today are saying what? Why are we doing these bullshit wars? Why are we doing these wars for Israel? And then what is happening in the midst of all this? What's happening is a massive, massive movement to question the narrative of the Holocaust. And this is where we get into some very, very dangerous territory. Like I said, Roman Catholic Church became abusive, people followed Protestantism, and that led them to a disaster. And then people began to follow the Enlightenment. And then what happened? The Enlightenment led to the French Revolution. And the French Revolution became way more abusive than whatever the hell the Enlightenment was fighting against. They became way more abusive than the French monarchy, way more abusive than any sort of Catholic society. They were beheading people over nothing, and they killed millions. Millions of people in France were killed because of the French Revolution. And the French Revolution was successful because people were following Enlightenment ideology, but it led them into absolute horror, chaos, and horrific bloodshed and massacring. So let's go. I was about to talk about the Russian Revolution, but I want to stick on a topic here. So you have this institution, or you have multiple institutions known as the mainstream media, all these media outlets, all these establishments. And because there have been cases of the media platforming bad ideas or platforming propaganda, platforming dishonest reporting, we have ended up in a disaster. In this case, it's the disaster of the Iraq War. And then people find out, wait a second, Israel was pushing us to go fight in Iraq, and they didn't send a single member of the IDF to help us. They were pushing all of the Western countries, America, Australia, England, France, Germany, to fight in this war, and it led to nothing but disaster. No more wars for Israel. And then people begin to question the Holocaust. And this is where we get into some very dangerous territory. Very dangerous territory. And it's a perfect storm, really, if you think about it, for Holocaust denialism. Because, as I said earlier, the Holocaust has become something that you just believe in. It's something that you are expected to believe in. And that's it. Done. And there's nothing wrong with believing that the Holocaust happened, just like there's nothing wrong with believing that any historical event happened. American Revolution, French Revolution happened, Russian Revolution, World War I, World War II. These events happened. The problem is believing in something, or being expected to believe in an historical event as cataclysmic, as horrific as the Holocaust, without understanding the details, without understanding the facts, without having some knowledge, some depth of knowledge on the Holocaust. And what happens is, because people just take for granted the belief in the Holocaust, people who have some knowledge on the Holocaust, who are Holocaust deniers, come along and say, you got it all wrong. They've been lying to you. I have the knowledge on the Holocaust that you don't, and now I'm going to teach you facts that you never heard of, and I'm going to present to you the argument as to why the Holocaust didn't happen. Guess what happens? People get convinced that it's true. The ADL, AIPAC, various Jewish organizations come along, they begin to protest, and then what happens? The people who are defending the narrative of the Holocaust, or the history of the Holocaust, the people who are saying that the Holocaust happened, I'll just put it that way, the people who are saying that the Holocaust happened are seen as the abusers. They are seen as the controllers, as the tyrants, as the despots, just like people saw the Puritans, just like people saw the Catholic Church, just like people saw the Tsar in Russia before the Russian Revolution. The established crowd, or the establishment, begins to be perceived as the tyrants, as the micromanagers. Why are you telling us what to believe in? Why are you telling us what to do? And the people who rebel against the establishment begin to use accusations that are very effective, actually, psychologically very effective. They begin to call the people who are defending the narrative of the Holocaust pearl clutchers, or Karens, or tyrants. They'll say, well, you're just pearl clutching. This man is simply questioning the established narrative. Mr. Bradley Smith, Mr. David Irving, Mr. David Duke, Mr. Nick Fuentes. These guys are simply asking questions. Why are you becoming so angry? Why are you protesting against their right to free speech? These people are simply observing their right to free speech. They're simply expressing their ideas. Why are you going against them? And the people who are defending the correct history of the Holocaust begin to be seen in a very negative light. And here is the very dark reality. No matter what they do, they will lose. If they say nothing, then Holocaust denialism is allowed to be percolated, and there's no one there to argue against them. And so the Holocaust deniers win. If the defenders of the correct history of the Holocaust begin to protest, if Jewish groups, pro-Israel groups, or just really good people begin to protest against this, then the protesters are seen as pearl clutchers, Karens, micromanagers, control freaks. They're seen as tyrants. They are seen as enemies of free speech, and they lose. So no matter what, they lose. No matter what, if we try to fight against Holocaust denialism, we lose. If Kanye West, not if, when Kanye West put out a song saying Heil Hitler, Heil Hitler, I mean, obviously this was very egregious, right? You're making a song praising Hitler, and what you're doing is you're actually just shifting pro-Hitlerism into the Overton window. You're making it normal, you're normalizing it, you're getting people to become accustomed to praising Adolf Hitler. If you protest against Kanye West's song, guess what? You're against free speech. You become an enemy of the First Amendment. You become a Karen, pearl clutcher. You become sensitive. You get these accusations of taking things too seriously, and no one wants to be seen as the person who overreacts. No one wants to be seen like this. And so no matter what, you lose. You lose. And Nazism is going to grow. Nazism is going to come back. And there's nothing we can do about it because of the nature of human beings. Because the Holocaust narrative, and when I say Holocaust narrative, it sounds like I'm questioning it, but I'm not. It's just the established history of the Holocaust, the historical consensus on the Holocaust has been the establishment for so many decades. And eventually, given the nature of human beings, we begin to rebel. Not me, I'm not, but enough people begin to rebel. And they say, no, just like people have rebelled against the mainstream media, just like people rebelled against the Roman Catholic Church, people are rebelling against established history. They're saying, no, actually, the Holocaust didn't happen. And if you go against them, if you protest against them, you become an enemy of free speech. And also, if you protest against them, you give them attention. And because you're giving them attention, you're giving them publicity. Because you're giving them publicity, you're giving them the limelight. And then guess what? Because they have the limelight, they get interviews, they're getting invited to various media outlets, they're getting invited to do debates, and then they become a point of view. They become the other side, and they become a legitimate position. They're not really legitimate, but they gain this perception of being a legitimate position. And then that's when Holocaust denialism gets shifted into the Overton window. And if you protest, you're seen as a Karen, or you are seen as an enemy of free speech. And Holocaust deniers, just like Enlightenment thinkers back in the 18th century or the 17th century, have pointed to certain abuses, right? Well, really just one abuse. I'll just specifically say one abuse here. And that is the abuse of the Holocaust. For example, people have used the Holocaust to gain money. People have used the Holocaust to pressure governments or pressure certain people to get money. People have accused people of being anti-Semitic when they aren't anti-Semitic. Perfect example is Mel Gibson. Mel Gibson did a movie about the crucifixion of Christ, and everyone has seen this film, right? The Passion of the Christ. And guess what happened? Mel Gibson got accused of being anti-Semitic for making this movie. There was nothing anti-Semitic about the film, but nonetheless, he was incessantly, like a broken record, being accused of being an anti-Semite, to the point where Mel Gibson mentally broke. And I saw this myself growing up in California and being around a lot of pro-Israel people. I have personally witnessed people saying that the film is anti-Semitic. And I remember there was a Jewish woman who had a TV show in California. And I knew this woman. And she came to our house for dinner. And she was super pro-Israel. She had a lot of friends in Hollywood. And she said, "Oh, Mel Gibson, don't even talk to me." And she had the voice. "Don't even talk to me about Mel Gibson." I said, "What are you talking about? What's the problem?" And I was shocked. I was like, 11 or 12. Oh, I was probably 13 years old at this time. And she said, don't even talk to me about Mel Gibson. And I was actually shocked. I was actually taken aback by this. I didn't understand why this woman hated Mel Gibson so much, because for me, Mel Gibson has always been a hero. I mean, this guy made the greatest film ever, Braveheart, greatest film ever made. So I was shocked. Why does this woman hate Mel Gibson so much? And she never explained to me why she hated Mel Gibson. She just told me how much she hated Mel Gibson, how Mel Gibson was this evil person. And I remember going upstairs and I was talking to my dad and I said, why does this woman hate Mel Gibson so much? And he said, because Mel Gibson made The Passion of the Christ. And The Passion of the Christ is seen as an anti-Semitic movie. And then I remember seeing the Passion of the Christ, and there were some very pro-Israel people who were with me. And, they were Christian. They weren't Jewish. So they were seeing The Passion because they're Christian. And The Passion of the Christ is a masterpiece. So we see the film, masterpiece, very good movie. So then we're in the parking lot outside of the theater. And I remember this woman who was with us saying, as great of a film as it was, I still get the sense that it's anti-Semitic. And I remember thinking, am I losing my mind here? Am I seeing something? Am I not seeing what you're seeing? Am I missing something here? What's going on? This is crazy. And though that type of accusatory behavior it's very bad. It doesn't make you look good. To accuse someone of being an anti-Semite when they're not doing something anti-Semitic, to accuse a movie of being anti-Semitic when it's not anti-Semitic, doesn't help your cause. It actually gets people to resent you, because what you're doing is you're abusing historical events, you're abusing historical miseries to try to pressure people to not say what you don't want them to say. And here's the thing is, I've been accused of being anti-Semitic numerous times. I have been accused of being anti-Semitic just for criticizing Judaism, just for pointing out things in the Talmud, just for criticizing Israel. I've actually been accused of being anti-Semitic. So the pro-Israel crowd, or people who believe in the Holocaust, certain people who believe in the Holocaust, have actually abused the Holocaust. And what this has done is it has left, to a certain extent, it has left a sour taste, a bad taste in some people's mouths. And then you have the manipulators, the Nick Fuentes types. You have these types of people who come along and they say, you see how they have used the Holocaust for their own gain? Isn't this terrible? Isn't this horrible? And then what happens? They begin to say, you see, these people are liars. They have lied about history. They have lied about Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler actually wasn't that bad of a guy. And if the Holocaust, and this is the argument that they make, I'm not saying I agree with this, but this is the argument that these people make. If the Holocaust was so true, why do they get so upset when people question it? This is the argument they always, always make. And it's very effective, because people could see, well, yeah, they actually have used the Holocaust to make money. I mean, Norman Finkelstein wrote a book called The Holocaust Industry, and that was a bestseller. In fact, that was Norman Finkelstein's first real successful book. Why was it so successful? Because a lot of people, and that book came out, I want to say in the 90s, early 2000s. It came out a long time ago. And that book spoke to a lot of people, because a lot of people noticed the abuses. Now, people will notice the abuses, or they will point out the abuses for very insidious reasons, because they want to get people to love Adolf Hitler. But nonetheless, those abuses exist. And as long as abuses exist, you will have opportunists who will use those abuses to advance an evil agenda. No matter what happens, as long as evil exists, as long as abuses are done, evil will have a reason to exist. Case in point, the Roman Catholic sex scandal. I don't even like calling it a sex scandal, because it's not really sex. To me, sex, I don't know why people say, oh, it's a sex scandal. Sex is a man and a woman having sex. That's sex, all right? What happened in the Catholic Church wasn't sex. All this abuse that happens in the Catholic Church isn't sex. It's sexual predator behavior. It's sexual abuse. It is sodomite behavior. But it's not sex. But the fact that the Vatican was covering up these horrific abuses for so many decades got people to hate the Roman Catholic Church. Now, do people still point to those abuses to get people to hate Christianity? Yes. Do people point out those abuses for a very destructive agenda, such as anti-Christian sentiment? Absolutely. But still, one thing that we can't deny is that those abuses exist. Those abuses happened, and they are still happening. And as long as they're happening, and as long as they happen, and as long as the institution, in this case the Roman Catholic Church, continues to try to water it down, and belittle it, people are going to have a reason to hate the Roman Catholic Church. It's just a fact. And so, because of the abuses of the Holocaust, Holocaust deniers have had ammunition, bottom line. And they have used that ammunition. And then when they begin to question the Holocaust and Jewish groups get upset, they begin to say, oh, poor me, I'm a martyr. So you can't win. That's the whole point. All evil points to other evils to justify its existence. How can you win? How can you beat that? And then when you try to warn people about this evil, what do people say? No. This person or this group of people isn't evil. They're pointing out real problems. And then when you protest even further, what do they say? You're a Karen. You're going against the First Amendment. You're an enemy of freedom. And then the evil movement that you're trying to warn people about only gets more and more powerful. You can't win. The train has been set. And people could complain about Holocaust denialism all they want until they're blue in the face. Holocaust denialism will continue to grow. And in fact, if people continue to protest against it, it's only going to give further attention for Holocaust denialists. They're only going to get more and more famous. I was looking at this interview between Candace Owens and Nick Fuentes. And Candace Owens in the beginning says, apparently Nick Fuentes is a Holocaust denier. He's someone who tries to get people to think Hitler was a great guy, all this stuff, pro-Hitler guy. And Candace Owens says, apparently I'm interviewing the most evil person in the world. And Nick Fuentes goes, yeah, that's what people say. I'm just so evil, and that's the type of thing that's the type of position that these people can take. Look at me, I'm the martyr. I just get accused of being evil. I don't know why. Why am I being called evil? I have no clue. And that builds this martyrdom complex, and that gets people to think, yeah, this person is being persecuted. Why? And if the Holocaust was so true, then why do these people who believe in the Holocaust get so angry when someone questions the Holocaust? So you can fight against it. You see Holocaust denialism growing. You see this pro-Hitler sentiment growing. You see Grok all of a sudden praising Adolf Hitler and calling itself, what is it, Mecha Hitler or something like that. The train has been set. And we can sit here and complain all we want, and we can protest all we want. It's not going to stop people from liking it. In fact, the more we protest, the more attention we give it. Now, I'm going to continue talking about it because I know that there's still going to be a certain number of people, no matter how small they are, there's still going to be a certain number of people who are going to listen. But as far as the general population goes, this thing's going to grow within the general population. And eventually Holocaust denialism is going to enter the Overton window. It's going to happen. Nazism is going to grow. And we're going to go right back into the cycle that we had back in history. Look at what's happening in Germany, for crying out loud. I mean, the Germans are talking about making nuclear bombs. The Germans are talking about reviving their military power. They're talking about becoming the most powerful, the most biggest military in all of Europe. And then on top of that, you have this revival of nationalism happening in Germany. Militarism and nationalism, that sounds like Germany going back to the past. And they're talking about, the Germans just approved of giving long-range missiles to Ukraine so that they can attack Russia through their Ukrainian proxies. I mean, what is this? What is this? This is Germany going back to the past, going back to its old ways. And if you look at the topmost general of the German military, Christian Freuding, I mean, the guy looks like a Nazi. He looks like someone got an SS officer, brought him back from the past and brought him here. Put him through a time machine and brought him here. The guy, you just look at him, you just say, oh yeah, he's a Nazi. I have no doubt. He has these crazy eyes. He looks demonic. And there is a photo. I mean, really, this actually happened. I don't remember which year this happened. This could have happened last year. But every year, the Germans have a celebration of the defeat of Nazi Germany. And instead of celebrating Victory Day, Christian Freuding, the topmost general in the German military, was in Ukraine hanging out with some Azov neo-Nazi. I mean, what's going on here? And if I say, look, Germany is reviving, this is bad, what am I told? What do I hear? I am told, wait, do you hate Germans? Wait, do you hate Germany? Wait, are you saying that Germany doesn't have a right to defend itself? Wait, are you saying that? And I'm not saying any of those things. I don't hate Germans. I don't hate Germany. What I am saying is that history repeats. And we have to be wary of this. And when we see nationalism becoming more popular than it ever has been since the defeat of Germany, and when we see the Germans talking about making nuclear bombs and approving to give long-range missiles to Ukraine and talking about making their military the most powerful military in all of Europe so that they can get ready for a war against Russia, I'm thinking, oh my God, World War I and World War II. But instead of most people saying, yeah, you're right, what the hell is going on? People are told, no, Germany needs to rise because, there's the big Russian bad guy. And what does this tell me? It tells me that people don't see anything through history. They don't see anything through the lens of history. And because they don't see anything through the lens of history, they are doomed to repeat it. And the evils of history will repeat themselves. And there's nothing that we can do about it. Because if we complain, we give it attention. And if we give evil attention, we give evil a platform. We give it a spotlight. We give it publicity. And we give it more popularity. And if we say nothing, then evil is allowed to speak with no one talking back, with no one speaking against it. So the best thing that we can do is say the truth and recognize that the people who are going to listen to us are going to be a minority. And that is totally fine because, well, narrow is the way. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. I've talked long enough, and I just wanted to get these thoughts out. Anyway, God bless.